Today I'm going to talk about how you can break through the ±3 exposure compensation dial on your PenF. Okay, so someone asked me a really good question from one of my other videos about how do you break through the ±3 exposure compensation limitation of the dial, exposure compensation dial on your PenF. Because the PenF has a dedicated exposure compensation dial, and it is limited to ±3 stops. And for what this camera was marketed for as a street camera, that's really more than enough, right? But you know, I guess in another video I was going ±5 exposure compensation with my EM10. So the question came up, how do you get more than 3 stops exposure compensation? And it's really very simple. You just program one of the other buttons or dials to handle the exposure compensation rather than the dedicated exposure compensation dial. But there's a little bit of a trick to it. It's not as straightforward as it should be. So let me just show you. Now I've done a full factory reset on this camera, and so we're all on the same page. And let's just go into the menu to the button dial function, and I have a video on programming all the button dials and my sets and things for Olympus cameras, so if you want a little more information about that, you can watch that one. But for this video, we're just going to do one thing. We're going to reprogram the function 1 button to be exposure compensation. Okay, and if you just scroll through here, it'll pop up eventually. Okay, there it is. So we'll click OK. And now I can confirm that I'm in exposure compensation is assigned to function 1. I click OK. And that should be it, right? But watch what happens. If I click the function button now, you'll notice that down here, these little up and down arrows appear above the aperture. And you know, they go off after a few seconds. But and the up and down arrows are for the arrow pad here. But you'll notice all it's doing actually is just changing the aperture, which is not what I told it to do. And that's because the exposure compensation dial on the PenF is still controlling exposure compensation. It's not letting any of the other buttons or dials do that. So what you have to do is reprogram this dial to do something else. Okay, and on the PenF it's in the dial function menu. But not the main one, okay? This is the main one that you see on all the Olympus cameras. It's actually this one here, plus or minus dial function, which is exposure compensation dial. And there should be a little arrow to the right here, so I don't know why that's not there. But if you push to the right, you can change what this button does, and it really only gives you 2 choices, right? Exposure compensation or flash exposure compensation. So I'm going to change this to flash exposure compensation. So now this dial is assigned to flash exposure compensation rather than you know, the metered exposure compensation. If I hit the function button 1 now, you'll notice that not only do I have the up and down arrows for aperture, I also have the right and left arrows for exposure compensation. And all I have to do to change exposure compensation is use the right and left arrow. And now if I hold it down, I can go all the way to -5, and that's the limit of exposure compensation for the camera's metering system. Of course, you can go into manual mode and do even more, but that's basically it. That's how you get beyond the ±3 stops of exposure compensation on the PenF. Then there was a follow-up question, once I explained how that's done, is why would you want to go -5 stops of exposure compensation? What would you use it for? And there's really a lot of uses, but I'm gonna give the one that I use the most. Basically, it's when I'm doing off-camera flash. I like to dial in negative exposure compensation to reduce the ambient light around the subject, and then light the subject using a speed light or flash, so that they stand out a little more. Because you know, there's different ways to get, you know, subject separation, right? Either through depth of field, or you know, by differences in lighting between the background and the foreground. Okay, so the easiest way really is through separating the light, having a darker background than the subject in the foreground. Okay, so let's just take a regular picture first. Okay, let me take the exposure compensation back to 0. And let's just take a regular picture here, okay, and see what it looks like. And, you know, it's amazing, right? $2,000 in gear here, and really it doesn't look any better than an iPhone could take. So this is where, you know, using off-camera flash and using exposure compensation -5, okay, it's going to make a big difference, and something that you can't do with, say, a cell phone or iPhone. Okay, so that's what I'll do. So I'm going to go ahead and dial in -5, and I'm just going to do a test shot here and see what that looks like. And as you can see, I've completely crushed all of the ambient light down here. And so now we're at, you know, a black picture. So now all I have to do is illuminate the subject, in this case the bust of this clown, with an off-camera flash, right? So for off-camera flash, if you see my video on easy off-camera flash, I like to shoot at 1/250th of a second. And you can see right now it's at 200. So I'm going to go into shutter priority mode. And what's nice is the camera's metering, along with the exposure compensation setting, keeps the camera at -5 stops of exposure compensation. Because if I take a picture again, even though I've changed mode from aperture to shutter, I should get exactly the same picture. You know, assuming it's within the limitations of the lens, etc. But usually going negative in exposure compensation, you don't have any problems. Okay. And yeah, of course, as you can see, I got the same exact picture, right? So let's go ahead and add off-camera flash, and we'll just do a test shot just to see what it looks like. And I just know, because we're indoors and this is going to be really close, that I can put this flash at the minimum power setting of 1/1/128. And this is just a cheap manual flash. I paid like $25 or $30 for. And I'm using very cheap triggers here. These are like $15 or $20 for these. These are universal generic triggers. And of course this flash stand, this is my Nikon flash stand. So yeah, this probably costs separately more than the trigger and flash combined, right? But anyway, let's go ahead and do a test shot, okay, with these settings and see what we get. And I'll do the typical quarter angle off-camera flash for portrait and take a picture. Okay, wow, that's pretty harsh. And also, if you look in the background, you can still see some of the clutter in my basement. It's not what I wanted. So what I'll do is let's get a little bit creative, okay? I can't reduce the power on this flash anymore. And I could go into manual mode and crush even more light via, you know, raising the aperture, but let's stick with this shutter priority at 1/250th of a second. And I really can't go any higher because that is the limit of the sync speed. I think I can go up to about 320, and I'll explain that in another video. But I'm going to use this piece of paper. It's just a white piece of paper, and actually these are these have my notes on it for my next video about how to extend battery life. And spoiler alert, you really can't. But okay, what I'll do is I'll just cover the flash like so, okay, and hold it at about the same angle and distance, and let's take a picture right there. Yeah, much better. Now we're getting to a picture that I think looks pretty good. The only other thing I would change here is probably, let's try my favorite art filter, which is really only available on a Pen F, as far as I know. But let's go into the black and white mode, and I'm going to use my favorite black and white profile, monochrome profile 2. So basically that's just a very high contrast, high grain image to kind of simulate an old black and white film camera. Let's try that. And we'll do about the same. Okay, yeah, that looks really good. Very creepy, right? I might bring the flash a little closer, take one more shot, but you get the idea. This is one of the uses of doing exposure compensation, is especially useful when you're using an off-camera flash. So, but anyway, thanks for the question. If you have any other questions, just leave them in the comments below. I really appreciate that and all of the wonderful feedback you guys have been giving me. So thanks for that as well. And I'm gonna, I have another video coming up, I think, on extending your battery life, and that's semi-interesting too. So go ahead and hit subscribe. But either way, we'll see you again soon. Thanks.